The rain was relentless, hammering down in sheets that blurred the neon lights of the city into streaks of electric haze. Thunder cracked overhead, a deafening roar that seemed to shake the very ground beneath my feet. I stood under the flickering street lamp outside my tiny garage, wiping grease-streaked hands on an already filthy rag. My name's Alex, and at 29, I'd spent most of my life fixing cars for people who barely noticed me, people who saw me as just another cog in their busy lives. But tonight felt different. Something about the storm made the air heavy, charged with an energy that set my nerves on edge. I heard it before I saw it. A sputtering engine struggling against the downpour, its headlights cutting through the darkness like twin beams of desperation. The car skidded to a stop right in front of me, water spraying from the tires. It was a sleek black sedan, the kind of luxury vehicle that screamed money even through the chaos of the storm. For a moment, I hesitated. Who would be out driving in this mess? Then the driver's door creaked open, and she stepped out. She wasn't what I expected. Drenched and shivering, her designer coat clung to her frame, but there was no mistaking the elegance in her posture, or the panic in her eyes. "Please," she said, her voice trembling as much from fear as from the cold. "I don't know what's wrong with it, but I can't get it to start again." Her accent was polished, refined, but there was something raw in her tone, like she was seconds away from breaking down completely. "Get inside," I told her, jerking my head toward the garage. "You'll freeze out here." She hesitated, glancing at me warily. Maybe it was the dirt smudged across my face, or the way my worn-out jacket hung loosely on my shoulders. Whatever it was, she didn't move immediately. But then another crack of thunder boomed above us, and she flinched, bolting toward the garage without another word. As I followed her inside, shutting the heavy metal door behind us, I couldn't shake the feeling that this night was about to take a turn I wasn't prepared for. The garage was dimly lit, the fluorescent bulbs buzzing faintly overhead, casting uneven shadows across the cluttered space. Tools hung haphazardly on the walls, oil stains marked the concrete floor, and the scent of gasoline mingled with dampness from the storm outside. She stood awkwardly near the workbench, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her soaked hair plastered to her face. Her wide, frantic eyes darted around the room, taking in the chaos of my world, a stark contrast to whatever pristine existence she came from. "Let me take a look," I said, grabbing a flashlight and heading toward the car. I popped the hood, and the faint hiss of steam greeted me as I leaned in. The engine was a masterpiece of engineering, gleaming even under the grime of the road and the storm. But something was off. A faint whine from the alternator, a stutter in the fuel line. I ran my fingers along the components, my mind racing through possibilities. It wasn't catastrophic, but it was enough to strand anyone in this weather. "You really know what you're doing?" she asked, her voice tinged with skepticism. I glanced up at her, catching the flicker of doubt in her expression. "Trust me," I said, my tone steady despite the tension in the air. "I've seen worse." Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she nodded reluctantly. "Okay, just hurry, please." As I worked, the silence between us grew heavier, broken only by the occasional rumble of thunder and the rhythmic tapping of rain against the roof. I could feel her watching me, her presence almost suffocating in its intensity. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, I spoke. "You shouldn't have been out in this storm. What were you doing all the way out here?" She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. "It's complicated," she murmured. "Complicated how?" I pressed, my curiosity getting the better of me. She sighed, running a hand through her wet hair. "I had to get away. From everything. Everyone. I thought driving would help clear my head, but..." Her voice trailed off, and she gestured vaguely toward the car. I raised an eyebrow. "From what? Or who?" For a moment, she looked like she might actually answer, her lips parting slightly. But then she shook her head, her defenses snapping back into place. "It doesn't matter. Can we just focus on the car?" I wanted to push further, to ask why someone like her, who clearly lived a life far removed from mine, would end up stranded in a rundown garage in the middle of nowhere. But I bit my tongue, knowing better than to pry too deeply. Instead, I turned my attention back to the engine, letting the familiar rhythm of diagnostics soothe my restless thoughts. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story, and that it might be far more dangerous than either of us realized. As I tightened the last bolt and wiped my hands clean, I turned to find her pacing near the workbench, her movements restless and agitated. The storm outside showed no signs of relenting, and the oppressive atmosphere inside the garage seemed to mirror the turmoil brewing within her. "It's done," I announced, my voice cutting through the tense silence. She stopped mid-step, her head snapping up as if startled. "Thank you," she said softly, though her gratitude felt hollow, weighed down by whatever burden she carried. She reached into her purse, pulling out a sleek leather wallet. "How much do I owe you?" I waved her off, shaking my head. "Don't worry about it. Consider it a favor." Her brow furrowed, suspicion flickering in her eyes. "Why would you do that? You don't even know me." "Because everyone deserves a break sometimes," I replied, leaning against the car. "Besides, it wasn't anything major. Just needed a little TLC." She stared at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, unexpectedly, her shoulders sagged, and she sank onto a nearby stool, burying her face in her hands. "You have no idea," she whispered, her voice cracking. "No idea what it's like." I hesitated, unsure whether to press further or let her be. But something about her vulnerability tugged at me, pulling me closer. "What's going on?" I asked gently, sitting across from her. She didn't respond immediately, her fingers twisting nervously around the hem of her coat. When she finally spoke, her words came out in a rush, as if they'd been bottled up for too long. "My father, he's not just some rich guy. He's powerful. Too powerful. And he thinks he owns me like I'm some kind of pawn in his games. I can't breathe anymore, Alex. Every decision I make, every move I take, it's all under his control. Tonight was supposed to be my escape. But now," she gestured helplessly toward the storm outside. "Now I'm stuck here." Her confession hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd always known wealth came with its own set of complications, but hearing her talk about it firsthand painted a picture far darker than I'd imagined. "So you ran," I said slowly. "But running doesn't solve anything, does it?" "No," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "But staying is worse." We sat in silence for a while, the weight of her words hanging heavily between us. I wanted to tell her that things would get better, that she could fight back. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. People like her father didn't let go easily. Still, I couldn't ignore the spark of determination in her eyes, the quiet defiance that refused to be extinguished. "I'll help you," I said finally, surprising even myself. She looked at me sharply, disbelief etched across her features. "Why would you risk that? You don't even know me." "Maybe not," I replied, meeting her gaze steadily. "But I know what it's like to feel trapped, and I know what it's like to want out." Her breath hitched, and for a moment, I thought she might cry. But instead, she straightened, her resolve hardening. "If you're serious, I'll need more than just a fixed car." "I figured as much," I said with a wry smile. "But first things first, we need to get you somewhere safe. This storm isn't letting up anytime soon." As I grabbed my keys and motioned for her to follow me, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Helping her wouldn't just change her life. It might very well change mine too. The drive through the storm was a blur of rain-slicked roads and blinding headlights, each mile bringing us closer to an uncertain future. She sat rigid in the passenger seat, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of her seatbelt. Every time a car passed us in the opposite direction, she flinched, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror as if expecting pursuit. I tried to keep the conversation light, asking about mundane things, her favorite music, where she'd grown up, but her answers were clipped, distracted. She was elsewhere, lost in a labyrinth of fear and paranoia. "They'll find me," she muttered suddenly, breaking the strained silence. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of certainty. "They won't," I said firmly, though I wasn't entirely convinced myself. "Not tonight. Not with this weather." She shook her head, her jaw tightening. "You don't understand. My father, he has eyes everywhere. People who report back to him. If I'm missing for too long, he'll send someone after me." I glanced at her briefly, noting the tremor in her hands as she fidgeted with the hem of her coat. "Then we'll stay ahead of them. Keep moving until we figure out the next step. Her laugh was bitter, laced with exhaustion. It's not that simple. Even if I disappear, he'll never stop looking. He doesn't care about consequences. Not when it comes to me. The gravity of her situation settled over me like a leaden weight. I'd known her life was complicated, but this was something else entirely. It wasn't just wealth or privilege. It was power, unchecked and unrelenting. And yet, as terrifying as it was, I couldn't bring myself to turn away. There was something about her resilience, her refusal to give in despite the odds stacked against her, that stirred something deep within me. We'll figure it out, I said, my voice steady despite the unease coiling in my chest. One step at a time. She didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the dark road ahead. But I caught the faintest flicker of hope in her eyes, quickly masked by the same guarded determination I'd seen earlier. We drove on in silence, the storm raging around us, until the city lights faded into the distance and the highway stretched endlessly before us. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean but eerily silent. The news, however, was anything but quiet. I flipped on the radio as we pulled into a small diner off the interstate, the static-filled voice of a reporter cutting through the hum of the engine. Breaking news. Billionaire tycoon Victor Langston has issued a public statement regarding the disappearance of his daughter, Evelyn Langston. Authorities are urging anyone with information to come forward, as concerns mount over her safety. Evelyn froze beside me, her coffee cup halfway to her lips. He's playing the victim, she spat, her voice sharp with anger. Typical. I frowned, turning down the volume. Does he always do this? Use the media to control the narrative. She nodded grimly, setting the cup down with a thud. Always. It's his way of keeping people in line, making them think he's the good guy while pulling strings behind the scenes. If he's calling the police, it's not because he cares about me. It's because he wants to make sure whoever finds me knows exactly who they're dealing with. Her words sent a chill down my spine. Victor Langston wasn't just a man with money. He was a force, a shadow looming over everything Evelyn had ever done. And now, thanks to our impromptu alliance, I was squarely in his crosshairs. As the day wore on, the stakes became painfully clear. News outlets buzzed with updates, each one painting a more ominous picture. Reports surfaced of private investigators being dispatched, security teams mobilized, and even rumors of bribes offered to local authorities. Evelyn's phone, which she'd powered off hours ago, remained ominously silent, a testament to the lengths her father would go to track her down. He's not going to stop, she said later that evening, pacing the cramped motel room we'd rented under fake names. Her voice was tight, strained. Every hour we stay hidden, he gets angrier, more desperate, and more dangerous, I added, staring out the window at the empty parking lot below. The weight of our predicament pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. If he finds us, he will, she interrupted, her tone chillingly matter-of-fact. It's only a matter of time. I turned to face her, my heart pounding. Then we need to be ready. We can't just run forever. Her eyes met mine, sharp and calculating. What are you suggesting? I hesitated, the words heavy on my tongue. We fight back? For a moment, she simply stared at me, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, a smirk tugged at the corner of her mouth. You have no idea what you're getting yourself into. Neither do you. I shot back, my voice firm despite the knot of dread in my stomach. But I'm not backing down now. Her smirk softened into something resembling admiration. Good? Because neither am I. The days that followed were a blur of adrenaline-fueled planning and sleepless nights spent poring over blueprints and financial records. Evelyn had access to information most people could only dream of: encrypted files, insider contacts, and a deep understanding of her father's empire. Together, we pieced together a strategy that felt equal parts reckless and brilliant. It wasn't just about hiding anymore. It was about dismantling the machine that had controlled her life for so long. Our first move was subtle but effective. Using a burner phone, Evelyn leaked documents exposing her father's illegal offshore accounts to a trusted journalist. The fallout was immediate. Headlines exploded across every major outlet, and regulatory agencies launched investigations into Victor Langston's business practices. For the first time in years, Evelyn saw cracks forming in her father's carefully constructed facade. "This is just the beginning," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of triumph and fear as we watched the news unfold. "He's vulnerable now." But victory came at a cost. Within hours, Victor retaliated with brutal efficiency. Anonymous threats flooded social media, targeting anyone remotely connected to Evelyn. One of her former colleagues, who had unknowingly provided her with key information, was fired under mysterious circumstances. Another contact disappeared entirely, leaving behind only unanswered calls and mounting dread. Each new development sent a fresh wave of guilt crashing over Evelyn. "I never wanted anyone else to get hurt," she confessed one night, her voice breaking as tears streamed down her face. "But I can't stop now. If I do, he wins." I held her as she cried, my own emotions a tangled mess of anger and helplessness. Watching her wrestle with the consequences of her choices was excruciating, but I couldn't shield her from the truth. "You didn't start this," I reminded her gently. "He did. And if we don't finish it, he'll keep hurting people, just like he's always done." Her resolve hardened overnight. By morning, she was back at the laptop, mapping out our next strike. This time, we targeted his political connections, exposing secret meetings and undisclosed donations that implicated some of the country's most powerful figures. The scandal rocked Washington, sending shockwaves through the corridors of power. Victor's allies began distancing themselves, abandoning him like rats fleeing a sinking ship. Yet even as his empire crumbled, his fury grew. Surveillance drones circled our safe house, and anonymous cars lingered suspiciously outside. Every knock on the door sent our hearts racing, every unfamiliar face a potential threat. Through it all, Evelyn transformed. The fragile, frightened woman I'd met on that stormy night was gone, replaced by someone fierce and unyielding. She stopped apologizing for fighting back, stopped questioning whether she deserved freedom. Instead, she embraced the chaos, channeling her pain into purpose. "He taught me how to survive," she said one evening, her voice cold and resolute. "Now I'm using those lessons to destroy him." And destroy him we did. Piece by piece, we dismantled the empire he'd built on lies and exploitation. But with each victory came a deeper understanding of the price we were paying, not just in terms of danger, but in the toll it took on our humanity. Revenge, I realized, wasn't just about justice. It was about becoming something else entirely. Something darker, something stronger. And as we stood on the brink of our final confrontation, I wondered if either of us would ever truly escape the shadow of the man who had shaped us both. The confrontation happened in the dead of night, beneath the skeletal remains of an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The air was thick with the metallic tang of rust and decay, the faint hum of distant traffic the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. Evelyn and I moved cautiously through the shadows, our footsteps muffled by the grime-covered floor. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to turn back, to run as far and as fast as possible. But Evelyn's grip on my arm was unyielding, her determination a palpable force that propelled us forward. Victor Langston stood at the center of the cavernous space, flanked by two burly men whose faces were obscured by masks. His tailored suit was immaculate, untouched by the filth surrounding him, a stark reminder of the gulf between his world and ours. For a moment, he simply stared at us, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he dismissed his guards, leaving the three of us alone in the vast emptiness. "So," he began, his voice smooth and measured, "you've brought this farce to its inevitable conclusion." Evelyn stepped forward, her chin lifted defiantly. "This isn't a game, Father. Not anymore." His lips curled into a sneer. "Oh, but it is. You think exposing a few scandals makes you untouchable? You're still my daughter, Evelyn. Always will be." "No," she snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. "I stopped being your daughter the day you decided I was nothing more than a pawn in your schemes." Victor's mask slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing the rage simmering beneath his polished exterior. "You ungrateful little—" "Enough!" I shouted, stepping between them. My pulse thundered in my ears, but I forced myself to meet his gaze. This ends now. Your empire is crumbling, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. He laughed, a cold, hollow sound that echoed off the walls. And what do you think you've accomplished, boy? Do you honestly believe you can take me down? I don't have to, I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. You've already done that yourself. All we did was shine a light on the truth. For a long moment, he said nothing, his eyes narrowing as he studied us. Then, with a sigh that sounded almost weary, he straightened his jacket and turned to leave. You've made your choice, Evelyn, he said without looking back. But remember this. When the dust settles, you'll have no one left to blame but yourselves. As his footsteps faded into the distance, Evelyn collapsed to her knees, her body racked with sobs. I knelt beside her, pulling her close as the weight of everything we'd endured crashed down on us. It was over. Finally, mercifully, over. In the weeks that followed, the world seemed to exhale. Investigations continued, but the worst of the storm had passed. Evelyn and I retreated to a quiet cabin nestled deep in the mountains, far from prying eyes and lingering threats. It wasn't easy. Neither of us was built for peace, but we found solace in the simplicity of shared silences and stolen moments of laughter. One evening, as we sat by the fire, Evelyn turned to me with a soft smile. Do you think we'll ever be free of him? She asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. I reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. Maybe not completely, but we're free enough. And that's worth fighting for? Her smile widened, and for the first time in what felt like forever, it reached her eyes. In that moment, I knew we'd found something neither of us had dared to hope for. Redemption, not just from the past, but for the future we were determined to build together.